The mahogany conference table in the executive suite felt ice-cold under my palms. Across from me sat Bradley Croft, the newly appointed vice president of M&A integration, his face flushed red with unearned authority. He slammed a single-page document in front of me, tapping a gold pen against the glass. "You sign this amendment, transferring the license for the valuation core today, Vance. Or you leave this building with security guiding you out. You have 10 minutes to decide if you want to ruin your career." I looked at the contract, then up at his smug grin, knowing that the digital keys to their entire $130 million buyout were currently resting in the hardware token clipped to my belt. I smiled, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and reached for the pen. To understand how we arrived at this boardroom showdown, you have to go back 8 years, to the spring of 2018. I was 40 years old then, with a couple of decades of financial engineering under my belt, when I joined a tiny fintech startup called Apex Valuation Systems. The founders had a great vision for automated corporate valuation, but they lacked the math and the architecture to make it scale. They were trying to value complex M&A targets, using bloated spreadsheets that crashed whenever you imported more than 10,000 rows of transaction data. I was brought in as the senior architect and valuation lead to build something that could handle real-time risk calculations, Monte Carlo simulations, and multi-layered cash flow projections. I spent 18 months writing the K-code. It was a proprietary engine written in Rust and optimized for high-throughput financial data. It did not just crunch numbers. It pulled real-time regulatory filings, SEC disclosures, interest rate spreads, and industry-specific market multiples, compiling them into a dynamic valuation model. In the M&A world, where a delay of 12 hours can cost a firm millions in arbitrage, my engine was a revolution. It took valuation timelines from 3 weeks of manual analyst work down to 45 seconds of automated processing. Because the founders could not afford my full market salary. Back in 2018, we made a deal. I took a 10% equity stake in Apex. But more importantly, my attorney drafted a highly specific intellectual property licensing agreement. It was registered under IP 20/8 HV. Under Section 9.2 of that agreement, the core algorithmic engine of the K-code remained my personal intellectual property. I licensed its use to Apex for a nominal fee of $1 per year. The license was strictly non-transferable, meaning it could not be sold, assigned, or sub-licensed to any third party without my express written consent. Furthermore, the agreement stated that if my employment with Apex was ever terminated without cause, the license would automatically and immediately revoke, and all system access keys would revert back to my control. At the time, the founders did not mind. They just wanted the engine running so they could attract venture capital. Fast forward to 2026. I am now 48, and Apex has grown from a 5-person basement operation into a highly profitable market leader with $25 million in annual recurring revenue. The database has expanded to house the historical financials of over 50,000 private and public companies. Our client list includes mid-tier investment banks and private equity shops that rely on our platform to structure their deals. That is when Croft Acquisitions entered the picture. Croft Acquisitions was a massive private equity firm founded by Victor Croft, a legendary, old-school corporate raider who built his empire in the 90s by buying up distressed manufacturing companies, stripping them of assets, and selling them for parts. Victor was 60 years old now, and he wanted to transition his firm into modern digital assets. He saw Apex as the perfect acquisition target to automate his firm's valuation processes. After 6 months of due diligence, Croft Acquisitions agreed to buy Apex for $130 million. It was a cash-and-stock deal that would net the original founders tens of millions. My 10% stake was valued at $13 million. But there was a catch. Victor's 32-year-old son, Bradley Croft, was appointed as the vice president of M&A integration. Bradley was the typical product of nepotism, an Ivy League MBA who had never built a company, never written a line of code, and believed that employees were simply rows on a spreadsheet that needed to be optimized. Bradley's mandate was to integrate Apex into Croft Acquisitions and cut operating costs by 30% before the merger officially closed on Monday morning. From the moment Bradley walked into our offices, He made it clear he did not respect the engineers who had built the platform. He wore custom-tailored suits, carried himself with an air of absolute superiority, and spent his first week auditing our payroll. During our very first integration meeting, he looked at my salary, then at my 10% equity stake, and scoffed. To him, an engineer making a six-figure salary while holding $13 million in equity was a corporate inefficiency that needed to be corrected. He did not understand that the entire tech stack of Apex was built around the K-code engine. He assumed that because the company owned the servers and the databases, they owned the software running on them. He did not bother to read the original employment contracts or the IP 2018 HV licensing agreement that was filed deep in the company's legal archives. I watched Bradley spend the next 3 weeks calling individual analysts into his office, cutting their benefits, and demanding they work 60-hour weeks to prepare for the transition. When our head database administrator complained about the lack of weekend support, Bradley fired him on the spot. The atmosphere in the office turned toxic. People were terrified of losing their jobs, and the founders, who were looking at their massive payouts, did not say a word. They were too busy planning their retirements in Aspen to care about the people who had made them rich. I kept my head down, monitoring the server clusters and ensuring that our primary DNS records and API gateways were secure. The K-code engine was hosted on a dedicated AWS infrastructure. The physical hardware security tokens and the root access credentials were bound to my personal developer account, which I had never integrated into the company's corporate network. I had spent 8 years protecting the integrity of this system, and I knew that without it, Apex was nothing more than an empty shell with a list of clients and no way to process their data. As the merger closing date approached, Bradley began his final push to clean up the cap table. He wanted to minimize the payouts to non-founder employees. On a rainy Friday afternoon, just 72 hours before the final documents were scheduled to be signed by the board, my phone rang. It was Bradley's secretary, asking me to come up to the executive suite for a brief meeting regarding my equity allocation. I knew exactly what was coming. I stood up from my desk, grabbed my coat, and made sure my hardware token was securely clipped to my belt. I walked toward the elevator, ready for whatever game the billionaire's son wanted to play. When I walked into the executive suite, Bradley was not alone. Sitting to his right was Clara Henderson, the head of human resources, who looked incredibly uncomfortable, keeping her eyes fixed on her tablet. Bradley was leaning back in his leather chair, tossing a gold pen in the air. He did not invite me to sit. He simply pointed at the mahogany conference table, where a thin 3-page document lay. "Vance, sit down," Bradley said, his voice dripping with casual authority. "We need to clean up some administrative details before the merger goes live on Monday." The legal team in New York was reviewing the IP portfolio, and they noticed a minor formatting issue with your original employment contract. "We need you to sign this amendment." I sat down, pulled the document toward me, and read it. It was titled Intellectual Property Assignment and Stock Option Amendment. I did not need a law degree to see what they were trying to do. The document was a complete surrender of my rights. It stated that I, Howard Vance, would transfer all proprietary interests, copyright, and licensing rights of the K-code valuation engine and all its subroutines to Croft Acquisitions. In exchange, the company would grant me a one-time performance bonus of $130,000, taxable upon the closing of the merger. Furthermore, Section 4 of the amendment diluted my 10% equity stake down to a mere 1%, claiming that the original allocation was non-standard and inconsistent with corporate guidelines. I let out a soft breath and looked up at Bradley. "This isn't a formatting issue, Bradley. This is a complete buyout of my intellectual property and a 90% reduction of my equity." Bradley smiled, a patronizing expression that showed he had never been told no in his entire life. "Let's be realistic here, Vance. You're an engineer. You were hired to write code for Apex. The company paid your salary, which means the company owns the code. The original contract you signed with the founders was amateur hour. A 10% equity stake for a single developer is absurd. My father's firm is investing $130 million into this company. We are not paying $13 million of that to a guy who sits in a server room all day. The original founders couldn't pay my market rate in 2018, I replied calmly. They agreed to the equity and the licensing agreement because my engine was the only reason Apex could secure its first round of funding. The K-code is registered under a personal licensing agreement, IP2018HV. It belongs to me. Apex only has a non-transferable license to use it. Bradley laughed, shaking his head. Vance, do you honestly think that little piece of paper is going to stop a $130 million acquisition? We have a team of 30 corporate lawyers in Manhattan who eat contracts like yours for breakfast. We've already cloned the repository. We have the source code. Your engine is running on our cloud servers right now. We don't need your permission. We are offering you $130,000 as a courtesy so you can keep your job as a maintenance manager after the merger. If you sign, you stay. If you don't, we will terminate you for insubordination. Tie up your equity in court for the next 10 years and you won't see a single dime. Clara Henderson cleared her throat, looking nervously at Bradley. Bradley, perhaps we should let Howard consult his counsel. No, Bradley interrupted, slamming his hand on the desk. We don't have time for counsel. The board meeting is at 9 a.m. on Monday. The auditors are arriving tomorrow morning to verify the assets. Howard signs now, or he's done. I looked at the document again. The text was clear. They thought they had cloned the codebase, but Bradley's technical ignorance was staggering. He did not realize that the K-code was not a static application. It was a dynamic engine that required continuous API validation, cryptographically signed data feeds, and local authorization keys that refreshed every 72 hours. The source code they cloned was just the front-end interface and the basic database structures. The actual calculation engine resided on my private AWS server instance, communicating via an encrypted API gateway. I looked at Bradley. His face was filled with arrogant confidence. He believed that power was just a matter of who had the bigger bank account. I won't sign this, Bradley, I said, sliding the document back across the table. Bradley's smile vanished. His eyes narrowed and his posture stiffened. You think you're indispensable, Vance? You're 47 years old. You're a dinosaur. We can hire 5 22-year-olds from MIT for half of what we pay you, and they'll write a better system in a weekend. You are making the biggest mistake of your life. That is your decision to make, I replied. You're damn right it is, Bradley sneered. Clara, process his termination immediately. For cause. Insubordination and breach of company policy. He doesn't get severance. He doesn't get his equity payout. Wilson file an injunction to freeze his shares before the weekend. He turned back to me, pointing a finger at my chest. You have 10 minutes to clear your desk. If you're still in the building after that, security will throw you out, and don't think about taking any company property. We'll search your bags. Understood, I said. I did not raise my voice. I did not stand up and yell. I simply stood up, buttoned my suit, and walked out of the boardroom. I could hear Bradley yelling at Clara to call the legal team as the door swung shut behind me. I walked down to my office on the 3rd floor. The room was quiet. I took my leather bag, packed my mechanical keyboard, my personal notebook containing 8 years of system architecture designs, and my hardware security tokens. I left the company-owned laptop on the desk, completely wiped of my personal credentials. I logged out of the local network, ensuring that all temporary session cookies were cleared. As I walked out of the building, the security guard, a man named Carl who I had shared coffee with every morning for 8 years, looked at me with a sad expression. He had obviously received the call from HR. I'm sorry, Howard, Carl whispered, opening the turnstile for me. Don't worry about it, Carl, I said, offering him a warm smile. Have a good weekend. I stepped out into the cool rain, the city lights reflecting off the wet pavement. I walked to my car, placed my bag in the passenger seat, and sat there for a moment in the silence. My phone began to buzz in my pocket. It was a notification from our system monitoring tool, warning that the API gateway was requesting a token refresh. I ignored it, started the engine, and drove home. The weekend had just begun, and I had a lot of work to do. The moment I got home, I went straight to my home office. It was a quiet room overlooking the backyard, equipped with a custom-built workstation, 3 monitors, and a secure fiber optic connection. I sat down, booted up my system, and placed my hardware tokens on the desk. First, I called Catherine Boyd. Catherine was a brilliant intellectual property attorney who had represented me for a decade. She was the one who had written the original IP 20188HV agreement. I had paid her out of my own pocket back in 2018 to ensure that my interests were protected, and that investment was about to pay off. I explained the situation to Catherine, detailing the meeting with Bradley, the threat to dilute my equity, and my immediate termination for insubordination. Catherine let out a dry laugh over the phone. They actually terminated you for refusing to sign an amendment that dilutes your shares and gives away your IP. And they called it insubordination? Howard, this is a gift. Under Delaware corporate law, refusing to sign a voluntary contract amendment that alters your pre-existing ownership rights cannot be classified as cause. That means for all legal purposes, you were terminated without cause. Which triggers Section 9.2, I said. Exactly, Catherine confirmed. Section 9.2 states that upon termination of your employment without cause, the license for the K-Code engine is immediately revoked. I will draft the formal notice of revocation and copyright infringement. I'll send it via certified mail and email to the general counsel of both Apex and Croft Acquisitions. I'll also copy the board of directors. They will receive it by Saturday morning. By law, they have zero rights to use, run, or host the K-Code engine starting the second you were fired. What about the source code they cloned? I asked. If they run that cloned code, they are committing willful copyright infringement, Catherine replied. And since the merger has not closed yet, they are misrepresenting their assets to their lenders and auditors. That is a federal issue. I'll have the cease and desist letter ready in an hour. After hanging up with Catherine, I turned to my monitors to handle the technical side of the revocation. Bradley believed that because they had cloned the codebase, they had the keys to the castle. But he did not understand how modern cloud infrastructure works. The K-Code engine did not run as a monolithic application on Apex's local servers. It was built as a decentralized microservice architecture. The databases at Apex held raw corporate financial data, but that data was encrypted at the column level. To decrypt and process the data, the Apex frontend had to make API calls to a core engine hosted on my private AWS infrastructure. Every 72 hours, the system required a mutual TLS handshake and a cryptographically signed token to keep the connection open. The private keys for these handshakes were stored in a secure hardware security module that was linked to my physical token. I opened my terminal and logged into my private AWS console. I did not delete the code. I did not sabotage their databases. That would be illegal, and I wanted to keep my hands completely clean. Instead, I simply executed my rights as the sole owner of the intellectual property. I navigated to the API gateway settings. With a few keystrokes, I revoked the OAuth 2. Zero client credentials that Apex's servers use to access the K-Code calculation engine. Next, I went to my domain registrar and changed the DNS delegation for the core calculation API. Instead of routing requests to the production API gateway, I pointed the domain to a static page hosted on a private server that displayed a simple message: HTTP 403 forbidden, license terminated by licensor. Finally, I disabled the automated decryption key rotation service. Without the daily handshake from the K-Code engine, the local database keys at Apex would fail to rotate. Within 12 hours, their databases would lock up, unable to decrypt any historical financial records or process new inputs. I leaned back in my chair and watched the live terminal logs. For the first few hours, nothing happened. The system was running on cached tokens. But at midnight on Saturday, the scheduled weekly batch valuation runs began. These were automated processes that compiled and updated valuation portfolios for our 3 largest investment banking clients. Suddenly, the log screen began to light up with red error codes. Connection refused, API key revoked, error 403, authentication failure, decryption key rotation failed, handshake terminated, batch process terminated, 0 of 14,200 portfolios updated. Every single request from Apex's servers was bouncing off my firewall. The front-end interface of Apex was still online, but it was completely hollow. If an analyst tried to run a valuation model, the system would return empty sheets and zero-value calculations. The system was functionally dead. On Sunday morning, Catherine emailed me the signed copy of the cease and desist notice she had sent to the executive team. She had included the original 2018 contract, the IP-2088HV licensing agreement, and a copy of the registered copyright certificates for the K-code engine. She had also sent a copy to Dilute, the accounting firm that was conducting the final audit for the M&A transaction. I spent Sunday afternoon working in my garden, completely ignoring my phone. I knew the storm was coming, but I was prepared. The legal and technical gears had been set in motion, and there was nothing Bradley Croft could do to stop them. He had wanted to show me who had the power, and now he was about to find out. I had spent 8 years building the foundation of this company, and I was not going to let a spoiled heir tear it down just to save a few pennies on a spreadsheet. I poured myself a cup of coffee, sat on my patio, and waited for Monday morning. On Monday morning, I woke up at 7 a.m., made a pot of black coffee, and sat on my porch. The rain had cleared, leaving a crisp, bright morning. At exactly 8 a.m., my phone began to vibrate. It did not stop. The first call was from Leo Brooks, one of the original founders of Apex. Leo was a decent guy, but he had always been conflict avoidant, which was why he had allowed Bradley to walk all over the engineering team. I answered. "Howard, thank God you picked up," Leo gasped, his voice trembling with panic. "What is going on? The entire platform is down." The integration team from Croft Acquisitions has been trying to run the pre-merger valuation tests since 7 a.m., and every single query is returning database errors. The Deloitte auditors are sitting in the main conference room, and the SEC compliance reps are asking why our core assets are completely locked. Bradley is screaming that you hacked the system. "I didn't hack anything, Leo," I replied calmly, taking a sip of my coffee. "I simply revoked the access credentials to my private servers, as is my right under Section 9(2) of the 2018 licensing agreement. When Bradley terminated me on Friday afternoon without cause, he legally revoked Apex's license to run the K-code engine. My attorney, Catherine Boyd, sent the formal revocation notice to your legal department and to Croft Acquisitions on Saturday. Did you not read it?" I saw an email from a law firm, but Bradley told us to ignore it. He said you had no leverage and that we owned the code. Leo was hyperventilating. "Howard, please, you have to turn it back on. The merger is scheduled to close at 4 p.m. today. If the auditors can't verify the core valuation asset, Croft's lenders will pull the financing. The whole $130 million deal will collapse. Then you should have a conversation with Bradley, Leo. He is the vice president of M&A integration. He made the decision to terminate my employment and my license. I am no longer an Apex employee. I cannot access company assets, and I certainly cannot allow unlicensed entities to access my proprietary intellectual property. If you want to discuss a new licensing agreement, you will need to contact Catherine." Before Leo could reply, I hung up. 10 minutes later, my phone rang again. The caller ID showed Bradley Croft's personal cell phone. I answered, placing it on speaker. "Vance," Bradley bellowed, his voice cracking with rage. "You think you can play games with me? This is corporate sabotage. I've already called our legal team, and we are filing an emergency injunction against you in federal court. We are going to sue you for everything you own, and I'll make sure the FBI locks you up for violating the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act." "Good morning, Bradley," I said, my voice steady and cool. "Before you call the FBI, you might want to consult your general counsel. I did not access or disrupt any of Apex's servers. Your local databases and front-end code are completely untouched. I simply disabled the API endpoints on my own private AWS servers, which host my personal intellectual property. You terminated my employment, which automatically terminated the license under the IP-2018HV agreement. You have no legal right to access my servers, and if your IT team attempts to bypass my security gates, that would actually be a violation of the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act. We cloned your repository, Vance. We have the source code. We'll just host it ourselves," Bradley screamed. "You cloned the front-end user interface and the basic SQL database schemas," I explained patiently. "The core valuation matrix, the risk calculation models, and the dynamic data decryption keys reside on my servers. Even if your engineers spend the next 6 months trying to reverse engineer the database, They cannot decrypt a single row of client data without the active cryptographic handshakes from my engine. And if you attempt to run any portion of the K-code without a license, my attorney will file for an immediate federal injunction to halt the merger on the grounds of active copyright infringement. I don't think your lenders will appreciate that. There was a long, heavy silence on the line. I could hear Bradley's heavy breathing. The realization of his own incompetence was finally starting to sink in. "What do you want, Vance?" Bradley muttered, his arrogance replaced by a desperate, defensive growl. "I have nothing to say to you, Bradley. Have your legal representatives contact Catherine Boyd. I believe she is expecting their call." I hung up the phone and turned it off. By noon, the chaos at Apex's headquarters had reached a boiling point. Catherine forwarded me an email from the general counsel of Croft Acquisitions. The Dilute auditors had officially suspended their asset verification process. They had flagged the K-code engine as a highly contested proprietary asset with unresolved ownership claims, which meant they could not certify the value of Apex. Without that certification, the banks that were underwriting the $90 million debt portion of the acquisition pulled their commitment. The entire merger was on the verge of falling apart, and the original founders of Apex were facing the prospect of losing their massive payouts, while Croft Acquisitions was looking at a catastrophic failure that would ruin their reputation in the private equity market. At 1:30 p.m., Catherine called me. "Howard, I just off the phone with the general counsel of Croft. They are desperate. Victor Croft himself has taken over the integration. He has demanded an emergency meeting at my office at 2 p.m. He wants you there. Are you ready?" "I'm ready," I said. "I'll see you in 20 minutes." I put on my best dark navy suit, adjusted my gold silk tie, and grabbed my leather folder. The young heir had tried to use his wealth and status to crush me, but he had forgotten that in the digital age, control of the architecture is the ultimate leverage. I walked out to my car, feeling a deep, quiet satisfaction. The board meeting was supposed to be a coronation for Bradley Croft. Instead, it was going to be a lesson in corporate reality. The conference room at Catherine Boyd's office was quiet, the large windows displaying a panoramic view of the city skyline. When Catherine and I walked in, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Sitting on one side of the glass table was Victor Croft, the founder of Croft Acquisitions. He was 60 years old, with sharp gray eyes and a stern, weathered face that showed he had spent decades in the trenches of corporate warfare. Next to him sat Bradley, who looked pale and defeated, staring intently at his hands. Next to them was Daniel Miller, the chief general counsel for Croft Acquisitions, looking exhausted. Victor did not wait for us to sit before he spoke. He looked directly at me, ignoring Catherine completely. "Mr. Vance, my son has made a monumentally stupid mistake. He is young, arrogant, and he did not bother to read the contracts that built this company. He assumed that because we had the money, we had the control. He was wrong. I am here to fix this. We want the K-code engine back online, and we want to close this merger today. What are your terms?" I sat down, placing my leather folder on the table. Catherine sat next to me, opening her portfolio. "Mr. Croft, my client's licensing agreement was violated when your son terminated him for refusing to sign a forced contract amendment," Catherine said, her voice calm and authoritative. "That termination was not for cause, which automatically revoked the license under Section 9.2 of the IP 20.8HV agreement. To resolve this dispute, restore the valuation engine, and allow the merger to proceed, we have a list of non-negotiable terms." Daniel Miller, the general counsel, nodded. "Let's hear them." Catherine laid out the document. "First, Croft Acquisitions will buy out Howard Vance's 10% equity stake in Apex Valuation Systems at the current target valuation of $130 million. That is $13 million, paid in full via wire transfer today. There will be no escrow holdbacks, no performance milestones, and no earn-out clauses. It is a clean cash buyout." Bradley winced but said nothing. "Second," Catherine continued, "we require a cash payment of $2 million to my client as liquidated damages for breach of contract, wrongful termination, and the public damage to his professional reputation. Third, if you want full ownership of the K-code engine and the copyright registry, you must purchase the intellectual property outright." The price for the complete transfer of the K-code copyright and all its subroutines is $5 million. And finally, I added, speaking for the first time, Bradley Croft must be completely removed from any management, integration, or operational role involving Apex valuation systems. He will have zero authority over the platform or the engineering team going forward. This is extortion, Bradley burst out, slamming his fists on the table. Father, that's $20 million. We can't let him do this. Our team can bypass his server, we just need a few days. Shut up, Bradley, Victor said, his voice quiet but incredibly cold. Bradley froze, his face turning red. He slowly lowered his head, completely silenced. Victor turned back to me. His eyes were calculating, measuring the cost. $20 million is a steep price for a single developer, Mr. Vance. It represents a significant premium on our initial budget. It's not a price for a developer, Mr. Croft, I replied, looking him in the eye. It's the price of the engine that runs your $130 million acquisition. Without it, you are buying a database of encrypted files and a list of clients who will leave the moment they realize. Your system cannot process their transactions. You are paying for the foundation of your new digital asset division. If you don't want to pay it, we can walk out of this room, and my lawyer will file a copyright infringement injunction in federal court by 3 p.m. The merger will die. Your lenders will pull their funds, and the industry will know that Croft Acquisitions failed to close a deal because they didn't read their own contracts. Victor stared at me for what felt like an eternity. He was an old-school corporate raider, and he respected leverage. He knew when he was beaten. He turned to his general counsel. Daniel, can we draft the IP transfer and the release of claims forms immediately? Yes, Mr. Croft, Daniel Miller replied. I have the templates ready. We can have them signed and executed within the hour. Victor looked back at me. The $20 million will be wired to your escrow account. The moment the bank confirms the transfer, you will sign the IP transfer agreement and restore system access. And as for my son, he will be reassigned to our logistics outpost in North Dakota to oversee truck maintenance. He has a lot to learn about operations. Bradley looked horrified, but he did not dare to speak. An hour later, Catherine's assistant walked into the conference room and handed her a document. Catherine looked at it, smiled, and turned to me. The wire transfer has cleared, Howard. $20 million is in your escrow account. I opened my laptop, connected to my private server console, and executed the reactivation script. I reinstated the OAuth 2.0 credentials, updated the DNS records to point back to the production API gateway, and rotated the cryptographic security keys. The system is back online, I said, closing my laptop. Daniel Miller checked his phone. Within 30 seconds, his screen lit up. The integration team at Apex reports that the database is decrypting. The valuation tests are running. Dilute has signed off on the asset verification. Victor stood up, offering me his hand. You play a tough game, Mr. Vance. It's a shame you are leaving the company. We could have used someone with your foresight. Thank you, Mr. Croft, I said, shaking his hand. But I think I've had enough of corporate life. I walked out of the office building and stepped into the warm afternoon sun. The rain had completely stopped, and the sky was a brilliant blue. I walked to my car, feeling a profound sense of freedom. The next morning, I read the financial news. The merger between Croft Acquisitions and Apex Valuation Systems had closed successfully for $130 million. The press release praised Bradley Croft for his role in facilitating the transition, though he was noticeably absent from the closing photos. I looked at my bank account, the balance displaying a life-changing $20 million. At 48 years old, I was completely financially independent. I had protected the code I spent years building, and I had stood up to the corporate bullies who thought they could take whatever they wanted. I planned to take the next 6 months off, traveling and spending time with my family. After that, I would open my own boutique M&A software advisory firm, helping startup founders and engineers protect their intellectual property from predatory buyers. The corporate suite thought they owned the world, but they forgot that the world runs on code, and the people who write that code are the ones who hold the ultimate key. I started my car, turned on the radio, and drove toward the highway, ready for the next chapter of my life.